So if I asked you who invented the modern world, right? Like, who gave us the scientific revolution, modern medicine, hygiene, Renaissance art, you'd probably picture, I don't know, Leonardo da Vinci in a sunlit Italian studio.
Oh, sure. Or Galileo looking through a telescope,
Yes.
Florence in the spring.
Right. You definitely wouldn't picture a paranoid, ancient, poison-drinking king from the coast of the Black Sea.
No, probably not. But today we're looking at a framework that suggests our entire historical timeline might literally have the wrong guy.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're unpacking in this deep dive. We're welcoming you to a massive, continent-spanning exploration of ancient philosophy today.
Because we tend to cling to this idea of a sudden European awakening. The narrative we're all taught is that Europe was just stumbling through the Dark Ages and then abruptly, boom, the lights came on.
Like someone just flipped a switch, right?
Exactly. People rediscovered Plato, and suddenly we had indoor plumbing and the printing press. But historical progress doesn't actually work like a light switch.
It's more like a slowly burning fuse, and that fuse is what we're tracking down. Our source material for this deep dive is a really comprehensive, highly detailed YouTube lecture transcript by a creator named A.R.J. Radislav.
And this framework connects some seemingly very disparate historical dots.
The mission here is to trace how these misunderstood, seemingly esoteric ancient texts didn't just, influence the modern world. They literally built the foundational software for how you and I think today.
To really grasp the scale of this, you have to completely discard the occult myths, like the magic that's attached itself to these ancient ideas over the centuries.
Strip away the magic and look at the brutal, rational reality, right?
Right. We have to look at literal translations, linguistic shifts, and how knowledge actually survived through some of the most violent periods in human history.
Which means, to understand the spark of the European Renaissance, we actually have to start by looking in the exact opposite direction.
We do. We need to go east, deep into the Himalayas, actually, to Tibet.
Which feels like a wild place to start a story about the European Renaissance.
It does, but we're starting with the ancient Tibetan belief system known as Bon.
Okay, so the Bon religion.
Yeah. And the standard, often repeated assumption is that before Buddhism arrived in Tibet, around the 7th century, the region was dominated by primitive paganism.
Just scattered animist tribes, right. That's what you usually read.
Right. But the evidence presented in this lecture framework points to something completely different. When the Buddhists arrived, they didn't find primitive tribes. They collided with a highly developed, theoretically complex philosophical system.
And it was already functioning as a state religion. But, okay, hold on. I have to push back on the geography here just a bit.
Go for it.
The framework claims that the founder of the Bon religion, a figure named Shenrab, was actually connected to a man named Vishtaspa.
Yes, Vishtaspa.
And Vishtaspa was an ancient Iranian king and one of the very first patrons of Zoroastrianism. We are talking about crossing the Himalayas here.
It's a massive geographic leap.
Right. The barriers between ancient Iran and Tibet are huge. Are we supposed to believe a full theological system just hiked over the deadliest mountain range on Earth entirely intact? Or is this, just a convergent evolution of ideas?
Well, according to the source, the linguistic footprint leaves very little room for mere coincidence. We aren't just looking at vague similarities here.
Like they both looked up and thought the sky was important.
Right, it's way more specific than that. We are looking at specific cosmological architecture that has been translated practically word for word.
Oh, wow, okay.
In the Bon cosmology, the universe is rigidly built out of 3 distinct spheres.
The 3 tiers.
Yes. There is a white heaven reserved for the gods, a red earth for humanity, and a blue underworld inhabited by water spirits.
White, red, and blue. That is an incredibly specific architectural blueprint for the universe.
It is, and that 3-tiered structure is a signature Indo-European concept. But the ultimate proof, the source argues, lies in the name of the supreme deity ruling over this whole system.
In Tibetan, the deity is known as the All-Good, right?
Exactly. But when you trace the etymology of that specific Tibetan title back to its roots, it descends directly from Indo-European and Vedic languages.
So it doesn't just translate to all good in a vague, benevolent way?
No, a much more literal translation is great divine ruler or heavenly king. That is the core Zoroastrian and Vedic concept of a supreme organizing intelligence governing the cosmos.
So it really is like a grand game of historical telephone.
That's a great way to put it.
A Zoroastrian king's philosophy forms in ancient Iran, physically travels across the Asian continent along ancient trade routes, hits the Himalayas, gets adapted into the local language, and just becomes the foundational text of a completely new religion.
Because ideology is incredibly durable, but, this migration philosophy wasn't just a peaceful exchange of scrolls between monks.
It never is it?
Rarely. It represented a fundamental, irreconcilable clash in how human beings are supposed to interact with reality.
Two massive belief systems colliding.
Right. You had the native Bon traditions rooted in this active Zoroastrian framework and the incoming Buddhist philosophy. And you are witnessing a battle over the very definition of human duty.
Which brings up one of the starkest contrasts we're exploring today, the philosophical battle between action and inaction.
A massive divide.
And before we unpack the mechanics of this, I need to make something explicitly clear to you, the listener. The lecture we are analyzing today uses this ancient philosophical divide to make some highly charged, specific arguments about modern political conflicts and war.
It's important context.
Yeah, so we are impartially reporting the claims made in this framework. We are not endorsing this stance, nor are we taking any political sides. Our goal is just to convey the interpretations contained in the original material so you can understand the argument being made.
And having that context really is crucial because the framework outlines a very definitive, forceful worldview.
How does it frame Buddhism in this context?
It looks at traditional Buddhism as a philosophy that views the material world primarily as an abode of suffering. The physical world is characterized by illusion, decay, and pain.
So the ultimate spiritual goal is to basically escape that suffering.
Exactly. Through non-action, withdrawal, and a profound detachment from worldly desires.
You essentially detach your emotions and your desires to save yourself from the inherent pain of existing in the physical world.
Right. Now contrast that with Mithraism, which the framework links directly back to the Bon religion, Zoroastrianism, and the older Vedic traditions.
And Mithraism demands the exact opposite. Right?
Complete opposite. It views the material world not as an illusion to be escaped, but as a literal battleground where universal order has to be maintained.
It demands an active, relentless physical struggle for truth and justice.
Yes. You don't retreat to a mountaintop to find enlightenment. You pick up a sword to impose order on chaos.
Which, honestly, perfectly explains the psychology of the Roman army.
Oh, absolutely.
The source points out that Mithraism, and specifically the cult of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, was immensely popular among Roman legionnaires.
It makes total sense if you think about their daily lives.
Right. If you're a Roman soldier stationed in some freezing, miserable camp in Britannia, a philosophy that tells you the world is an illusion and you should just detach from desires doesn't really help you survive the winter or win the battle.
Not at all. But a philosophy that tells you your physical struggle is part of a cosmic battle for justice. That gives your suffering immense, tangible meaning.
It transforms violence and hardship into a divine mandate.
And the framework applies this ancient paradigm of Mithraic action directly to the concept of modern warfare. It references the Bhagavad Gita to really illustrate this point.
Specifically, the famous dialogue with Krishna and Arjuna.
Right. Krishna is urging the warrior Arjuna to fight in a devastating, bloody war against his own relatives.
And Arjuna wants to retreat. He wants to choose non-action.
Naturally, he wants to avoid the horror of killing his kin. But Krishna insists that true spiritual duty requires taking a definitive side.
You have to fight.
The framework uses this to argue that true spirituality isn't about hiding in neutrality or claiming to love everyone while allowing evil to flourish.
It argues that destroying what is wrong and fighting for justice, even when it requires this ultimate gruesome sacrifice, is the highest spiritual calling.
And again, we connect this to the bigger picture. This is a highly specific, militant interpretation of spiritual duty that the framework applies to geopolitical conflicts.
It's viewing spirituality not as a retreat from reality, but as a mandate to confront it head-on.
Exactly.
And this idea of the active worldly philosopher who physically enforces order on the world, this leads us directly to one of history's most mysterious, almost mythical figures.
Oh, this is where it gets really interesting.
A man who embodied both deep cosmic philosophy and ruthless practical political survival.
If you have ever looked into alchemy or the occult or ancient magic, you definitely know the name Hermes Trismegistus.
The thrice great master of hidden knowledge.
That's the one. And historically, he is almost universally portrayed as a legend. I mean, he's often depicted as an ancient Egyptian god of magic.
Or a survivor of Atlantis.
Right, or sometimes even an extraterrestrial entity who gifted advanced knowledge to humanity before just vanishing.
But our deep dive today hinges on an incredibly bold historical claim from the source.
He does.
Hermes Trismegistus was not a god. He was not an alien. He was a real, flesh and blood, deeply flawed historical human being.
The framework argues that the historical Hermes was actually King Mithridates, Eupator of the Bosporan Kingdom.
Which was located in modern-day Crimea.
Yes.
Okay, I have to stop and ask the obvious question here. How does a human king from the Black Sea, a guy whose main historical claim to fame is basically fighting a bunch of wars against the Roman Republic, get transformed by history into an immortal Egyptian god of magic?
It is a massive leap, isn't it?
It's a huge leap.
But the transformation happens through the psychological friction of encountering someone who possesses knowledge that looks completely indistinguishable from magic. Plus, the Greek habit of syncretism.
Because Mithridates wasn't just a military commander.
No, he was a true polymath. He was a philosopher king operating at the absolute cutting edge of ancient science. He exhaustively studied theology, astronomy, alchemy.
He didn't just order armies around. He physically designed optimizations for their armor based on metallurgical experiments.
He was brilliant.
Yeah.
But he was also completely paranoid about being poisoned by his political rivals.
Which led to his most famous and frankly terrifying scientific pursuit, Mithridatism.
Yes, the practice of building immunity to toxins. Because he was so terrified of assassination, he took sublethal doses of various lethal poisons every single day of his life.
Just think about the logistics of that in the ancient world for a second. You don't have modern measuring equipment.
Not at all.
To survive doing this, he had to master the exact botanical properties of toxic plants, the chemical interactions of animal venom.
Even the specific astronomical timing of when to harvest them for maximum or minimum potency.
So he is sitting in a palace in Crimea drinking literal poison and surviving.
And if you're an uneducated outsider, or even, an educated Roman general, this level of chemical mastery doesn't look like the scientific method.
It looks exactly like dark magic.
Right. He seemed invincible. He was a human who made himself immune to death through what appeared to be sorcery.
But was actually just brutal, highly disciplined scientific experimentation.
Exactly. And furthermore, he didn't worship the standard chaotic Greek pantheon of gods who were always fighting with each other.
Right. Preserved Bosporan inscriptions show he worshipped a supreme, organizing solar deity referred to as God the Highest.
So he was practicing a form of monotheism that closely mirrored the highly structured Zoroastrian and Vedic traditions we discussed earlier in Tibet.
So you have an allegedly immortal king practicing a highly advanced form of scientific monotheism immune to poison who deeply understands the mechanics of the natural world.
And over centuries, as his kingdom eventually fell and his writings were scattered, later generations just lost the scientific context.
They mythologized him.
They did. The Greeks and Romans took this brilliant, magically immune philosopher king and folded his legacy into the archetype of Hermes Trismegistus.
Okay, so if King Mithridates of Crimea was the real historical Hermes, what exactly did he leave behind?
The writings.
Right, because a legend about a poison-immune king is one thing, but if we are claiming this guy sparked the European Renaissance, we really need to see the receipts.
Well, the receipts are the Hermetic Corpus. This is the collection of writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus.
And the framework argues that these specific texts fundamentally altered the trajectory of human civilization.
Let's look at the very first book of this collection, which is famously known in Western literature as Poimandres.
But the framework points out that Poimandres is actually a Greek corruption of the original title.
Yes. The original Sarmatian name for this text is Psi, which translates to radiance of the mind.
And the core philosophical engine of this text revolves around the Greek word nous, right?
Exactly. Nous is usually translated loosely as mind or reason.
But the framework digs into the linguistic roots and equates this concept of nous directly to the Slavic and Vedic concept of Brahman or Brahman.
Yes.
This is where we need to unpack the mechanism, I think, because a lot of people hear radiance of the mind and assume it's just nice poetic imagery.
Sure, it sounds very esoteric.
Right. So how does a concept about a radiant mind translate into Renaissance engineers building indoor plumbing? What is the actual mechanism connecting those two things?
What's fascinating here is that the mechanism is philosophical permission.
Permission.
Yes, nous doesn't just mean human intellect. It represents a universal, interconnected cosmic intelligence. It means the universe is a rational machine governed by observable rules.
And that human reason is a fragment of that divine mind.
Exactly. Think about the medieval period. The prevailing dogma was that the physical world was fallen, corrupt, it was decaying. The only thing that mattered was the soul.
So studying the physical mechanics of a leaf, or the anatomy of a human body, was often viewed as sinful.
Or just a massive waste of time, because the physical world was just a temporary punishment anyway.
The universe was chaotic and subject to the unpredictable whims of God or demons.
But the Hermetic Corpus proposed the exact opposite. It argued that you can understand the mind of the Creator by intimately studying the mechanics of the creation.
So the physical world isn't a sin to be avoided?
No.
No.
It is a rational puzzle waiting to be solved by human reason.
That completely flips the script.
It really does. So when these manuscripts finally reached Western Europe in the 1400s, brought by scholars fleeing the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, the impact on European intellectuals was seismic.
You have Marsilio Ficino, right? A
Ah.
brilliant scholar working for the Medici family in Florence.
Yes, he is in the middle of translating the newly rediscovered works of Plato.
Which is a huge deal on its own.
Huge. But when the Hermetic Corpus arrives, Cosimo de' Medici literally tells him to stop translating Plato and translate the Hermetic text immediately.
Wow. Prioritizing it over Plato.
Because they believed they had found the original ancient source code of all theology and science.
And this framework argues that this specific injection of Crimean Greek knowledge inspired revolutionary thinkers like Giordano Bruno.
It broke the medieval psychological block. It gave humanity the theological green light to develop modern hygiene, map the stars, engineer aqueducts, and produce the mathematically precise art of the Renaissance.
Which means modern listeners owe much of their contemporary lifestyle to the survival of these specific philosophical texts.
It's incredible to think about.
We owe the foundational mechanics of our world to a poison-drinking king's meticulous notes on how the universe operates.
It is an incredible argument for how practical, rational observation gets buried under history.
And nothing perfectly illustrates how practical science gets swallowed by a cult myth, quite like the most famous artifact associated with Hermes Trismegistus.
Oh, the Emerald Tablet.
We have to talk about the Emerald Tablet.
The Tabula Smaragdina. If you have ever touched alchemy, esoteric history, or even popular fantasy, you know the legend of the Emerald Tablet.
The myth states it was a giant magical emerald carved with the ultimate universe-bending secrets of reality.
And the framework just ruthlessly debunks this using basic material science.
It points out a glaring physical impossibility.
Try to imagine a piece of natural emerald large enough to serve as a book cover, say the size of an A4, A5 sheet of paper.
Okay, picturing it.
Now imagine trying to carve a massive philosophical manifesto into it. Natural emeralds of that size, without severe structural inclusions or fractures, simply do not exist in the Earth's crust.
And even if by some miracle you found a raw gem that large.
Trying to carve text into it with ancient tools would exploit its natural cleavage planes. The stone would shatter instantly. It is structurally impossible.
So what does this all mean? It's like someone claiming they found a fully functional iPhone from the Middle Ages made entirely out of a single solid diamond. It sounds incredibly mystical, it makes for a great story, but scientifically, it's utter nonsense.
Completely.
So if he wasn't carrying around a giant magical gem, what was he actually writing on?
The framework argues it was high-quality, clear green glass.
Glass?
Yes. In the ancient world, manufacturing perfectly clear, colored glass without impurities was an incredibly advanced technology. It required precise control over furnace temperatures and chemical additives.
So to an ancient person seeing this for the first time, amazed by its clarity and color, they just associated it with the most valuable green thing they knew.
Emeralds. It was a technological marvel of human engineering, but it was manufactured in a kiln, not mined from the earth.
Think about the cultural impact of that. It's like someone in the Middle Ages seeing a glowing tablet screen and writing legends about a magical stone of infinite knowledge.
They didn't have the vocabulary for the technology, so they called it magic.
But what was actually written on this green glass tablet?
That is the most profound part of the story. The text of the tablet contains the famous maxim, as above, so below.
A phrase that modern pop culture almost exclusively uses to mean something spooky, witchy, or magical.
But the framework explains that as above, so below, is actually a deeply rational scientific statement of physics.
Really?
Yes, it means that the microcosm perfectly reflects the macrocosm. The structural forces governing the atom are reflected in the structural forces governing the solar system.
Oh, wow.
The fluid dynamics of a drop of water operate on the same mathematical principles as the swirling arms of a galaxy.
So it's the blueprint for universal physics, not a spell book.
Exactly. It is the ultimate expression of the Hermetic concept of nous. It is a declaration that the universe is not random. It makes sense, it scales perfectly from the microscopic to the cosmic, and human reason has the capacity to decode it.
That is just wow. Let's take a second to recap the sheer scale of the journey we just went on today.
We covered a lot of ground.
We really did. We started by pushing through the geographical barriers of the Himalayas to examine the highly structured Bon religion of Tibet, tracing its three-tiered cosmology back to an ancient Zoroastrian king.
And we explored the deep psychological clash between the Buddhist concept of escaping a suffering world and the Mithraic demand to actively, physically fight for justice.
A cosmic battle that gave profound meaning to Roman legionnaires. And then we stripped the myth away from the legendary god of magic, Hermes Trismegistus.
Revealing the framework's claim that he was actually King Mithridates of Crimea, a brilliant, paranoid polymath who used the scientific method to survive lethal poison.
And we unpack the mechanism of how his writings, the Hermetic Corpus, with its focus on universal reason, gave Renaissance thinkers the philosophical permission to study the physical world.
Breaking the medieval dogma and leading directly to the scientific revolution.
All of this culminating in the realization that the magical emerald tablet was actually just a technologically advanced piece of green glass carrying a profound observation about the fractal nature of physics.
It forces a complete reevaluation of the line between myth and science. And, that leaves me with a final provocative thought for you to consider.
I love these. Let's hear it.
We spent a lot of time today discussing the Hermetic concept of nous, this ancient idea of a single, universal, interconnected mind that contains all knowledge, which these early philosophers were desperately trying to tap into.
The radiance of the mind.
Right. Well, look at what humanity is actively building right now with the global internet, cloud computing, and artificial intelligence.
Oh, that's interesting.
We are literally constructing a global, interconnected brain. We are building a sphere of pure data and reason that any human on the planet can theoretically access.
Isn't that exactly what the concept of nous was attempting to describe?
Perhaps our modern digital landscape isn't a break from ancient history at all. Perhaps it is simply the ancient Hermetic corpus evolving into a literal technological reality. We might finally be building the mind that Mithridates was writing about on green glass 2,000 years ago.
The internet as the ultimate hermetic artifact. Well, that is a thought that will absolutely keep you up at night. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. It really goes to show whether you're looking at the origins of Renaissance engineering or a 2,000-year-old piece of green glass, you always have to look past the murky legends to find the rational truth hiding beneath. Keep questioning everything, keep learning, and we'll catch you on the next one.